Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity Podcast, our series, The Politics of Paganism. I'm Alex Denley here with Dr. Andrew Jones.
Hello.
So this is our second part on St. Thomas Aquinas and the Treatise on Law, and this is a less read section when most people treat it, but it is deeply important. This is understanding the old law and then the movement into the new law. And what we're doing here, we're going to be deep in theology and really in the mystery of salvation history.
Yeah, right.
So we're going to give it a shot.
If we present ourselves as understanding all this, then we're making a mistake.
Right. We don't understand the full mysteries here. So.
But one thing I would say before we get going too far into this is the way the Treatise on Law itself works, which is, like you said, often it's only the first few questions that are read. Most versions of the Treatise on Law in English that are used with students are only those first few questions. And we talked about and they go through the different types of law and that kind of thing that we talked about last time. But I think the way to really understand what Thomas is doing with this treatise is that those first few questions are giving us a lexicon or a philosophical vocabulary and a certain cosmology and anthropology, a certain understanding of the cosmos and man within it, that then enables us to understand the course of salvation history, which is the reason why we go from those questions on the different types of law into the old law and the new law, which combined are far more text than the initial questions on the types of law, and are actually then what are going to, in order to understand what he's doing in the first few questions with the different types of law, the philosophical discussion, the theological discussion that comes afterwards really points back to those concepts and the philosophical action there and explains what it really means.
So he's building the lexicon in order to then apply it to salvation history, which is where we see law in action.
And it shows us what it really is. You know, like there's a, like, for example, and I know we're going to go through it, but it just to jump right to the end. Like in his discussion of the new law, which is perfect law, right? The perfect laws of the new law, he just repeats over and over again that in the first instance, it's grace. But in the preface to the Treatise on Law, he says, God is an exterior principle of human actions in two different ways. He instructs us with his law and he assists us with his grace, as if law and grace are two separate things. But then in the end, the perfection of law is in the first instance grace. So you see, like, the theological discussion then compromises. It compromises by thickening the divisions that underwrite the first movements of the Treatise on Law.
So he's dividing them to understand them,
and then puts them back together,
and then puts it back together in the actual history of it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
Which is important to understand, because you can get with Thomas. This is so common that because he makes these distinctions in order for understanding, that we can get trapped in the distinctions and start mistakenly think it's some sort of formal system, and not understanding that those distinctions were only for understanding, and that actually we have to put those pieces back together in order to really grasp what's going on.
Right. Because the whole thing is God's gift.
That's right.
All the way through: eternal law, natural law, divine law, and the end point of it, like you're saying, is the actual infusing of grace in the soul to lead man to his final end. And that's maybe where we can start. Where he starts in the old law is the necessity of it, that man is ordained for a supernatural end, and therefore it's necessary for God to be the one but giving the divine law to lead man on to that end. Because
there was divine law from the beginning. We talked about this last time, that divine law was necessary from the beginning, from Eden, right? Because of what you're saying, that the supernatural end exceeds man's natural capacity, right? Or which is actually maybe not the right way of putting it. His natural capacity is to receive the divine law that he might receive the supernatural end. Right, he has potencies that exceed his ability to activate them. But then what happens is that divine law after sin, then what we talked about last time, where when man rejects his receptivity to the divine law, and he rejects that and posits himself or his own law as if it is the eternal law. So the human law, which remember was a the formation of human law as being the manner in which man participates or man actualizes the natural law, which is his participation in the eternal law, under justice. That's the way it works. But when man falls and purports himself to have the knowledge of good and evil, not just participation in good and evil, but the possession of it, what he's doing is positing human law as eternal law. And this is where we are moving as that's the construction of the closed world, right? The construction of the pagan cosmos. That's the beginning of it. But it's important then to see that once that divine law is cut off, then because of man, not because of God, but man has rejected it, that we are now in that perpetual motion problem of the effect exceeding the cause that we talked about with the pagans.
Yes.
Right? Like that's the world we're in. And the tradition refers to that as the age of nature. And what they mean in the age of nature, meaning the age of nature not elevated into the divine law, the age of nature left to its own devices. Right? Sometimes the tradition will also refer to it as the age of the natural law. I mean, man was just left with his natural inclinations. And what flows from those. But what flows from those is exactly this decline into depravity, right? That's because without that supernatural intervention or that elevation that comes from the divine law, that's what's left to man.
Yes. And I could just, if we're tracing it in the Old Testament, you can see how the fall of Adam, which has its origin in pride, which will become important for the bestowing of the law, in humiliating man, that immediately proceeds to Cain and Abel, and then Lamech, and then we have the building of we have this sons of God saw the daughters of men were fair, and everyone's corrupt. Then the flood, and then we have the Tower of Babel. And eventually, when you get to the time of the patriarchs, this goes exactly to the temple slave state. You were describing that Jacob's 12 sons, that they end up having to go to Egypt once Joseph is, he was going to be killed and then he got saved from it. But then they're in Egypt for, I think you mentioned 435 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And what are they under but a temple slave state under Pharaoh?
Yeah, and it's one that itself is not static. So the decline of Egypt deeper into depravity over those 400 years is a decline that is real. Like the Egypt that Joseph goes to is not the same Egypt that Moses calls them out of. Do you see what I'm saying? Like itself is declining into the pagan slave state. It is in this circular downward spiral. Egypt itself is, and so Israel is participating in that, right, and becoming more like them. And I think that maybe it's important to understand why that occurs, that downward spiral, because, or more of a philosophical explanation of it. It has to do with law itself, because law. You remember when we talked about, I think we talked about law and virtue and the connection between those two, and the necessity of the political. So if we think about that just for a second, we can say, well, why is law necessary for the formation of virtue? And it's, there's two reasons that Thomas gives us. The first one is that man, even not under sin, needs instruction. So the truth of the universe that man is capable of exceeds the truth that he's capable of achieving on his own. And so he has to be instructed by those who are more virtuous. So those who are further along in the process of ascent to the divine, right, can instruct him into virtue and therefore move him from being a more imperfect to a more perfect man, or move him deeper into virtue. So there's this positive instructional component to law, human law, which is obviously human law as a participation in ultimately the eternal law. But then there's a second a function of law in relationship to virtue, which is that under sin, people who have vices or who have habituated themselves into sin, or been habituated into sin, need law to pull them out of that sin, right? They need law to instruct them. So if you think of a society that is mixed, like all societies, has a mixture of people with various degrees of virtue and various degrees of vice, that the relatively more virtuous people are capable of perceiving in the relatively more vicious people the nature of their vices and the nature of the virtues that they ought to have, and the virtues that they do have, that the ones below them do have. Because man's never totally depraved, so there's always something to work with. And then to legislate in such a way that you play upon or you work upon the virtues that are already there in order to move that relatively lower person relatively higher.
Yes.
Okay, so the lawgiver then is the one who has more virtue and therefore more insight, more ability to see the truth of things, and therefore to lead the lower higher. But the problem with that is that if you're cut off, if the ascent all the way into the infinite is cut off, that those relative higher, relative lower, that's still operative. But the virtuous man the relatively more virtuous man can only ever see the vice of the relatively more vicious man from within his conditions of virtues and vices. He can't surpass that. Do you see what I'm saying? So what this means is that there is, in any human society, even a fallen society, the law still has its two purposes, right? It's still, but the two purposes of leading people into virtue, two ways in which it leads people into virtue, but that becomes relatively deformed or relatively impoverished to the extent that the highest man or the men with authority are themselves descending into vice. Right, because they lack now the ability to see, or to see what's the truth of what's happening to the people who are less virtuous than them.
Does this occur when they cut themselves off from the higher? Which
yeah,
would
that's
be
right.
God himself?
So now you live in a world that isn't open upwards, but it's closed downward. There's a false ceiling.
Got it.
But that false ceiling, as the perpetual motion machine peters out, that false ceiling descends. You see what I'm saying? So when you think of it having a downward spiral, right, into depravity, this takes time, right? It's over generations, and the proper functioning of the law becomes over time less and less adequate. But the reason why I'm talking about this, the idea I'm trying to get at here, is that second function of law, that remedial or pedagogical, not pedagogical in the positive sense, but remedial, disciplinary form of law, which is necessary to move people out of vice into virtue. And it can't be merely pedagogical in a positive sense. It has to have that kind of negative remedial mode of being. That as a society descends, the law it would need in order to pull itself out of its state is exactly the law that it cannot make for itself because it needs it.
Yes.
Right. So the law it needs is a law it can't give, right? Because it needs it. Do you see what I'm saying?
I mean, we could describe it in terms of Egypt as well. So when, as the account proceeds, it's the ruler of Egypt becomes friends with Joseph because of this, the famine and the dream he has about the cows, and you need to store up grain and all this. But then it says, once the rest of his family come to live in Egypt and they continue to grow, a Pharaoh arose later who did not know Joseph.
Exactly.
Who did not know that this was, and you can see if the ceiling was, let's say, a little bit higher during the time of Joseph in Egypt, among the rulers and the people of Egypt. As that continues, and you can even think of it psychologically, like as leader, I'm the leader of the people, I'm the ruler, and over time it ends up developing into I'm a god, basically. And then at the end of it, it's like Pharaoh is a god, and all of the constructed world that's being built of this is the river god, the sun god, it's all controlled by the temple, and you have the full Israelites who are slaves. It's like, that's how it proceeds downwards, and we're in the temple slave state.
Yeah, I mean, and
they need the divine law even more, but they can't create it on their own.
Yeah, I mean, they need human law that they can't create.
Because human law descends.
Human law is the manner in which the eternal law through the agency of the divine law and the participation in the natural law becomes realized. And so you can't that human law that would be necessary in order to become better is impossible for them to create. This is the reason why the descent into these pagan slave states isn't arrested. I mean, what isn't capable of being stopped, because it's the decline is the very decline of the intellectual ability to even perceive what's happening. You see, like the
oh yeah.
So you have I mean, and this is important, I think, because even though maybe it seems like a tangent, I think it's important that after the fall, it's not like we flip a switch and everyone is evil immediately. It's not like all of a sudden, bam, we're in a position where everybody is the worst kind of pagan temple slave state. Like, that's not what happens. Rather, we're into the world that Plato and Aristotle are describing. Like, we're into the world of the cycles of regimes. But those, like we talked about there, those cycles of regimes have a trajectory towards depravity, right? Like it where maybe the ancients aren't perceiving, are missing something, is that they're perceiving that it sort of goes endlessly around and around and around. And it's like, well, it is going around and around, but it's going around and around downwards.
Yeah, in
right?
bigger circles.
It's a spiral.
And even Plato describing that the seed of tyranny, of democracy and oligarchy is present in aristocracy, that they can
absolutely,
they can perceive the decline will precipitate at some point.
Yeah. So the thing is, then, when we look around at pre-Christian or and not just pre-Christian historically, like before the coming of Christ chronologically, but also pre-Christian in the sense of societies that have not yet received Christ, right? So societies that are still in the age of nature in that sense. You see various degrees of depravity, right? It's not that everywhere we look, throughout all of history and throughout all the world, everywhere we see Egypt at the time of Moses. That's not the case, right? What you actually find this, I think, very interesting situation, which maybe this is too much of a tangent, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. Like that anthropologists have found, it's a really good experience with this, with the discovery of the New World and with the discovery of Australia and other places like that, was that people, the further back, I guess is a kind of a ambiguous term here, but the further back into like hunter-gatherer kind of like family-based societies, right? Pre-civilizational societies, the less that you have gods and priests and sacrifices, and the whole sort of regime of paganism is not present the further back you go, right? All the way back to the point where you can get to people where it's not quite sure they have gods at all. Right? Like, do they even really have gods when it's the ancestors and when it's the river and it's the deer and it's the, like,
the Cherokee versus the Aztec is very different.
It's very different. Yeah. Very, very different. And the Aztecs are clearly worse. Right?
I mean, they're further along the cycle.
Yeah, but the reason why this is important for the biblical narrative is it helps us understand things like why is Israel left in Egypt for 430 years, right? Like Thomas says, everything happens for a reason. Why are they left there for 430 years? And there's something about the necessity of their habituation into a decline, into a civilization that is, and this is ironic because when we say decline, a secular historian would say the rise of the civilization, right? The construction of the cities and their religions and their priesthoods and their, the empire. But what we're saying is that is in fact, the decline into an ever more false world, an ever more completely false world, right? Fictitious world. And so they're left there in order to become like the Egyptians. And one of the things what are the Egyptians like? I mean, the Egyptians are miserable, right? So when you get this decline into the life of the Egyptians, it terminates with the Israelites crying out for help, right? Like we've achieved some sort of like total rock bottom condition, like, and we're going to cry out for help, and that crying out for help seems to be the prerequisite for the giving of the help. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, because it's somewhat of a move back to that receptivity, like asking for something from above, from outside, some echo of that primordial openness to the divine law, right? It has to become present in the midst of that, right? So to have lived in the bottom, and then to ask for something you know not what. At that point, you know not what it is, and so when Moses pulls them out, it's very significant, I think, that they come out into the wilderness, right? Because the wilderness is that which is not yet ordered by man, right? So it's like pulling them out into the original condition, pulling them out into the cosmos of nature, right? And now you're in a scary world because it's a world that isn't ordered by the priests and the gods and the rituals and all the things that supposedly subdued and had made the universe under human control are all of a sudden gone. And you're out in the wilderness. And what's their reaction? We don't want to be here. Isn't that like this place?
No, right.
This place is not a place.
This is terrible.
This is not a place we want to be.
They asked for something and they didn't get exactly what they wanted. You know what I mean? That does happen. But and when they're moving into the wilderness and they're passing through the Red Sea, it's like, you know, and the fathers make the analogy with baptism, that there's like a baptizing of you are no longer the Israel enslaved to the Egypt, you are now Israel in the wilderness.
Right.
And and their first reaction is, well, look, in Egypt we ate our fill of the, you know, all sorts of things, and now we have this like bread from heaven that doesn't taste all that great.
Well, I mean, it goes back
up
to what we were talking about earlier in the earlier episode when we were talking about the logic of the construction of the pagan slave state is reasonable, right? Like the logic, it is the most powerful formulation. Like the reason why the playing out of human society plays out into these sorts of regimes is because it's the one that provides the food and provides the security, right? It's the security of the slave barracks, the food of the slave, you know, the regular feeding of the draft animals, you know, like it, and it is capable. It's the one most capable of doing that. And so that's not crazy on the part of Israel. They're right that things seem to have been were more secure back in Egypt, right? Less scary in a sense.
Yeah, and it says they're grumbling against Moses, just like pretty justifiable, you know, in some regard.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, it's wrong, and then we have the giving of the Decalogue and the divine law, with Moses seeing the face of God and receiving the laws given by God. And immediately when he comes down to give them the law, they are already having an orgy in front of the golden calf and doing a Egyptian pagan ritual sacrifice.
Yeah, but this makes perfect sense, right? Because of what I was saying earlier here and trying to preface this conversation is that Israel had declined to a point in which the most general propositions of the natural law were obscured. Right? So you were already getting to the point where the human law was so depraved that it was the natural law, the most general propositions that human law could generate of right and wrong, true and false, were themselves inadequate. Right? So when Moses presents the Ten Commandments that come directly from God, and the tradition, including Thomas, say the Ten Commandments are an expression of the most general propositions of the natural moral law that we can generate, right? The most general propositions. Well, in the first instance, you would think, okay, here are the propositions of the natural law. Then Israel, you don't have them, you can't formulate them because of this condition you find yourself in. Because your world has become this depraved world of gods and rituals, and so of golden calves.
Yeah.
So here is the natural law. All right. So now you would think, great.
Now
we can do it. Now we can build the human. Now we can specify it and determine it and build the human laws and move. But that doesn't work for exactly the reason we talked about it in depth last time. That the propositions, the formation of propositions as reasons for action are tied, and the intelligibility of propositions for reasons of action are tied to the habitual virtue or vice of the one receiving them, right? So you can't I know this is hard, but law as a middle term between the ruler and the ruled, that law is a form of discourse or a form of instruction, which means that the one giving it has to give it in such a way that the one being ruled by it can receive it and receive it into their practical reasoning in such a way that it leads to good actions with good intentions, which then meet the virtue, which then allow you to spin back around and be more receptive to higher level goods, to higher level truths, right? And so you get into this an upward spiral. But if that one who is to receive it isn't in a condition to be able to receive it, then it doesn't. In fact, it not only does it not inform them towards truth and goodness, but it may in fact make them worse, right? Because it now pits truth, the articulation of truth, against their vicious inclinations. In which case, if their vicious inclinations are going to win the day there, then what they do is figure out how to navigate the now true law. How to get around it, how to navigate, how to trick it, right? And their viciousness actually becomes more clever or more wicked, right? So my point is that the giving of the natural law, the most general propositions of the natural law, won't work precisely because of the way in which in their last podcast we talked about the interconnection of the eternal law, the natural law, the human law, and the divine law, because they're all bound up together in one understanding of human nature. You can't just give the propositions of the natural law. That doesn't work, right? And so I think there's a pedagogical thing going on here in the scripture where it's showing us that through the experience of Israel that doesn't work, right? So like you said, the golden calf, okay, and then what happens? And then what happens is the giving of a law, and this happens over various stages, a couple different stages, but I think we can just collapse it all.
Yeah, the giving of the law by Moses on the plain.
Yeah, there's a couple different stages.
Deuteronomy.
Yeah, but if we just pull it all together into one thing, which is basically what Thomas does, is that it is what is given ultimately is a specification of the Ten Commandments, a specification or determination of the general propositions of the natural law, which is human law, right? Like when we talked last time about human law was those specifications or determinations of the natural law for the people. So if what God now gives in the old law through Moses, through the rulers of Israel, is a specification or determination of the natural law, what he's really giving is what by rights ought to have been human law, which is and so the divine law now becomes, now has descended. The divine law has descended into the realm of man, idolatrous man. You see, like down into, so Israel's left in Egypt to become like the Egyptians, pulled out of Egypt, and now in this condition where they can't make law for themselves. They can't. Human law is inaccessible. Just human law is impossible to them. And so God's divine law, which is always the thing that comes from above to provide the surplus that man can't extract from the world, right? That surplus that allows him to move beyond his own nature. Well, now his nature is descended into a less than human nature, and so what God, the divine law now, without changing what it is, now includes within it a descent into what was once space that was occupied by human nature, right? The making of human law.
Yes. Right.
So he specifies and determines the natural law in a way, and that's why when you read the old law, it reads like a human law code. Right?
Definitely. And this becomes important, in the New Testament in Matthew 19 when you have Jesus fighting with the Pharisees, and they bring the tricky question to him, which is Moses allowed for a bill of divorce that you can give, and he allowed basically for divorce or remarriage. So what do you say here? And he said, from the beginning it was not so, but God made them man and woman, therefore they are not two but one flesh. And it was for the hardness of your hearts that Moses allowed you to do this. And so we can even see there that it's a human law a specification of the human law because of how bad Israel was at the time. Now, there's different interpretations of why the allowance is there for divorce and remarriage, but you can see that it's because they're so wicked that this would be better than forcing upon them the perfect what they're able to do in grace. So it's condescending to where Israel is at the time.
Yeah, that's right, and it's a law. This is the thing where it gets back to the point we were making earlier, that it is exactly the law that Israel needs that is the law that Israel can never make for itself, right? Because it needs it, right? So it's a law that surpasses its condition, but surpasses its condition by having descended into its condition. You see, so like understanding where they are and then giving them an articulation of the natural law that is coherent to them or intelligible to them, right? And this is a paradox in the human nature. Human nature, this can't occur, right? It's necessary that this happens. This comes from above or from outside, right? From the divine, in order for that law to be given. Mm-hmm. But it's given in the idiom of fallen man. It's given the law is now the truth. And if you think about this, what the word, the truth that uttered by God is the word of God as the second person of the Trinity. So we're talking about the articulation of Christ in the idiom of the nations, basically. So in the idiom of idolatrous fallen man, in the idiom of the Egyptians, right? Which is one of the curiosities then when you read Exodus, say, where it just sort of repeats often that this is for the sake of the Egyptians. And that's weird, right?
Yeah,
because it
right.
almost is like throwaway lines, like this is for the sake of the Egyptians, so the Egyptians can see it, and all this. And it's like, well, what's going on? It's like, well, Israel can become the light to the nations,
Totally.
precisely because Israel's called out from the nations into the wilderness, so out of their civilizations, and then given a perfectly true articulation, specification of the natural law for their fallen condition in the language, in the idiom that is intelligible to them, which is a language that's intelligible to the peoples around them, right? Which is the reason why it takes on the external forms of the peoples around them. I mean, you think about, the sacrificial form and the priesthoods and the temples and the altars and the incense and the whole, whole form that it takes on is a language that's formulated by paganism, right? So God is taking over the language of that, the ritual symbolic language. And because it wasn't totally depraved, right? Because man is never totally depraved. That symbolic language has within it the grasping after the true and the good in some form, which means it can be used to articulate the true and the good.
Yes. Yeah, it reminds Aquinas in describing the old law has a lot of like particular questions. One that interests me was whether it was suitable to have one temple instead of many temples once they eventually build the temple. And what he says there is that it was suitable for them at the time to have one temple so that there wasn't idolatry. So for the forbidding of idolatry and the centralization of worship so that you could forbid idolatry everywhere else so there wouldn't be multiple temples. But in the new law, in grace, obviously from the setting of the sun to the rising, from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name is great among the nations, and anywhere worship can be given. But you can even see there that Thomas is describing how God is taking Israel from among the nations to be a light of the nations, but is leading them through the process that eventually leads to grace. But they have to go through each progressive step to get there. In order to reach grace.
I think that we're so Christian that we read these stories sometimes backwards, right? Like what I mean is you brought up the temple. And it's just sometimes good to remind ourselves that the pagans invented such things, right? Like the pagans came up with temples and came up with priests and came up with sacrifices and came up with, right? Like, and that even when we go back to Eden and we describe, it's very common to describe Eden as a sort of temple, and Adam is a priest and Adam is a king, and all of that is true. But the analogy. It's important that we understand which direction the analogy is going, right? That we're saying like, well, man in the age of nature created kingdoms and priesthoods and temples, but that wasn't totally depraved. There's some grasping after the truth that's present in there, even though it's a downward spiral, and that well, the true king was Adam, or the true priest, the true temple is Eden, right? And the expansion of Eden into the world is the expansion of a temple cosmos. But it's important to understand that we're using analogy from a later period that's lower to then try to describe what happens earlier at a higher point. And so we have to get the analogy going the right direction.
Oh yeah,
right?
That's fascinating.
And that is, and the reason why that's important is for what you just said, is that when God gives them a temple, a tabernacle, and then a temple, it is a pagan form, right? Like a pagan form that's being granted to them. He's condescending to them and saying, okay, I mean, I'm going to be kind of silly here, but it's something like, okay, you guys are idolaters and you understand temples. And so we're gonna have a temple, we're gonna have a tabernacle, we're gonna have this thing, but guess what's not in it? Is you go deeper into it and you never get to the idol. There's no idol. So it's like the very heart of what the temple is in the pagan world, which is the place where the idol is, right? That's the very like essence of it isn't there. So it's like, so what you have is the linguistic or the symbolic form without the essential piece.
Wow.
Okay, so you could communicate. I'm like that. I'm like those gods, right? Kind of. I'll be your God, right? You be my people. I'll be your God. Oh, gods are in temples. Yeah, okay, we'll build one. All right, so you understand that I'm kind of like those other gods. And then you go in, but I'm not there. Right, but I am sort of there, but I'm not there in the way the idols are there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you go into the holy place and then the Holy of Holies behind the curtain, and the high priest only goes there once a year. And what does he go into? But the tabernacle is there, and there's no idol he's worshiping.
There's no idol,
And he goes back to the people, and he goes back to the priests in the holy place, and then the rest of the people are in the court. But that whole setting is a condescension to them, right? Like to them being like the nations and needing a temple. Once we're viewing it from the age of grace, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, I think that because we read history through the eyes of Christianity, we forget, or we sometimes don't see just what a profound move this is on the part of God, that the pagans are really the ones who invent the concept of gods, right? And we talked about how that comes to be, right? The concept of gods, and for the Lord to say, "I'm kind of like a god," it's like, ooh, cringe. Do you know what I mean? Like
Sure.
But that's the language. That's actually the language we get. I mean, I've read this. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on this, but I've read that even the language of divinity that we use in the Bible to apply to the Lord God is derived from paganism, right? That we have God. These words and these ideas that were used by the pagan religions are then reapplied, but reapplied in a way like you were just saying, like there is no idol in the temple, meaning we're going to use this word, but now we've stripped it of it. It still has some of its meaning, but the essential piece of the pagan regime that it defined or it discussed is gone. So the word is becoming, or the concept is becoming, diffused, right? Yeah. Like appropriated and then shut off. Do you know what like? So you have that. I think then when the idea that the old law, which is given to Israel as a perfect determination or specification of the natural law for them in their time and place, in their moral condition that they find themselves in, that law then, because it is actually uttered by God, this is very confusing, and I get muddled in this. So I'm sorry if I do. But when we talked about the human laws being analogical, being analogical to ultimately the eternal law. This move on the part of God is very hard to understand because it is analogical, but for Israel, but it seems like only from one direction. Like it's only like half analogical because God Himself is speaking it. So He's speaking it for them, but He's speaking it not from within their closed world or within their microcosm, which is the way a normal human law would be uttered, right? From within the microcosm.
Yes.
So it's analogical both from the condition of the one speaking and the one receiving. It has an analogy in both senses. Here, you have a people that are in a closed world, but the speaker is God Himself, and so the analogy it blows apart the analogy, right? Like the analogy is on one side, but not on the other side. The other side is God actually speaking Himself, and this is the reason why the church fathers in the whole tradition can see in the old law Christ, right? Because the old law is the utterance of the second person of the Trinity, the Word of God, to the people of Israel. But it's an intellectual articulation. It's the way in which law is a determination that's linguistic and symbolic, but it nevertheless is an actual articulation from God of Himself, which makes it in the idiom of a certain people. Which makes it incarnational.
Yes, right.
All right.
And this is the fathers, that the new law is in the old, and then the old is revealed in the new.
Right. We're not talking about some sort of literary device. We're not talking about typology. You're not talking about little things that point to this or that. You're talking about the very essence of what this law is that it's Christological. Like in it, and you have. I mean, this is why at one point, Thomas in the Treatise on Law, I think he's quoting Augustine. He is quoting Augustine, or citing Augustine, where he says that had they kept something to the effect of, had they kept the old law, that the very form of life of Israel would have been the form of the body of Christ. Like the very, the very form of life, the structure of the world that they would have lived, the society would have been the body of Christ, because the articulation of this law is Christological, right? So had they done it, but of course they can't.
Yeah, and kind of the height of that was the Davidic kingdom. And there's something else I want to add to this, and this might help with understanding this. The analogy you set up, that it's analogous for human law in their own specification, but on God's side, it is actually just the truth He's presenting. He's not condescending to some degree.
There's not some participation in the truth on His side.
Yes, in some smaller world or something.
Yeah, which is the way human law works normally.
and for St. Paul in Romans, and Aquinas picks this up with the promise, or for Paul, it's epaggelia. And the promise is given to Abraham prior to law. And the promise is given even to Adam and Eve of the descendant the seed shall crush the serpent's head. That the promise is God's pure gift that He will bring redemption and that He will bring salvation to the whole world. And in the promises given to Abraham that I will make of you a great nation, I will make your name great, and then give universal blessing, that those tell us of the different ages that Israel's going to have to go through. But what's constant through it is the promise. In Romans 9-11, Paul shows us how the promise comes prior to law. The grace of the redemption comes prior and is there in law and has to go through law eventually to get to Christ, to the ultimate redemption. And so it's not as though, because this gets difficult, because Thomas deals with the question of whether the old law was good. That's where he starts. And and what he says is that the old law is good in relation to imperfect and perfect.
Yeah, like a boy to a man.
And Paul talks about it this way as well, that the old law was a pedagogue, or just a mean teacher, and having to coerce in different ways. But it's when the promise is finally fulfilled we can really see what the old law was. This preparatory looking forward to the coming of Christ, and ultimate fulfillment. And so it's not so both the giving of the law is grace, but also the ultimate promise is behind the giving of the law. The law is pointing you to the promise.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know this gets tricky to sort out.
This is why the question is, why was this period of the old law necessary? Right?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, that is a question. Why did it happen? Why didn't Christ, why didn't the new law, why didn't the incarnation just occur immediately after the sin? Like, why was it necessary to go through this whole history?
Mm-hmm.
And I think Thomas's answer is, and maybe I'm extracting out of this or extrapolating something out of this, is very profound. It's that the pride that led to the first sin, that even after the sin occurred and even after the consequences occurred, the pride that led to it is so profound, so deep, that it has to play out all the way, right? Like, it has to play out all the way in order to get back to that condition, that willingness to humble oneself, like that willingness to ask for something from above to save you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so like it's like when we talk about addiction and stuff, and you talk about people having to hit rock bottom, like you're an alcoholic, and you're an alcoholic, you have a problem, but it's not really until things get real bad that you say, okay, I need to do something, and then the first step is isn't it an appeal to a higher power? Like, I can't do it on my own, right? Mm-hmm. So there's something very wise about that there's this descent is a prerequisite, but then the question becomes, okay, so if Israel descends into a certain condition where it becomes now receptive to the law in some form, like it becomes open to the giving of the law, and the law is given, why wasn't just at that point the total law given, the new law? Mm-hmm. Right?
Grace in the wilderness,
Yeah, why not? Why wasn't that just the point at which it happens? And what Thomas says is that he divides this into, he says, well, man's pride is on two accounts. He's proud of his intellect, and he's proud of his will, which are both just his reason, right? But we've divided them up into intellect and will. And that God left them in the age of nature so that they could despair of their natural reason, that their natural reason was capable of knowing the truth. And then the written law is given, the old law is given, that they might know the truth. So that humbles them with regard to their intellect. But then they find that they can't obey the law, right? And so now they know the truth, but they can't live the truth. And so they despair of their will, right? And then are ready for the giving of the complete law, which is both intellect and will in Christ, right? Both pieces. And that's a nice, that makes sense to me, right? But the problem with it is that it makes sense about Israel, but then it becomes difficult to understand how that is applicable to all of humanity, right? Because Christianity is the redemption of all of humanity. So if we're going to say that this was necessary in order for them to be ready to receive Christ, well, then you would seem to think, well, then it's necessary for everybody to go through this period. Everyone, before they can receive the gospel, has to have the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And yet that's not what occurs after the coming of Christ. Yeah. And so why then does it occur? And this is, and I think that there's various ways of looking at this, or trying to answer. There's many different answers, I think, and they all maybe kind of like flow together.
Yes. And
give you a sort of fittingness argument for it. Mm-hmm. But I think one of them is, and an important one goes back to the idea of mythology, and I'm going to say that this may be a little bit of a stretch, but I think there's something here that the foundation of the pagan regimes, the foundation of human regimes, is, like we saw when we talked about Plato, is ultimately mythology, but mythology in the form of these sort of paradigm stories, right, that have certain plot lines in them. And those plot lines become the manner in which the cosmos makes sense, or the way in which we understand the dynamism of the cosmos into these plot lines, which then makes them receptive, makes the people who have those mythologies receptive to whatever the ruling mechanism is, right? So it's sort of like a deeper law, the myth.
Yes.
And it seems like that maybe there's something to the idea that what is necessary is for humanity to be given a new story, right? Like a new mythology that we can then adopt, right? In that the new law doesn't reject it, but it becomes the myth for the new law, right? You see what I mean? Like that deep story that makes the new law, makes people receptive to the new law, or somehow complements their receptivity to it, right? They have a vision of the cosmic order that allows for the new law to work. And I think that this story that we're telling about the old law, this story, which is not merely a story, but actually happened, so it's not just a myth, it's a true myth, is that story of the experience of the inadequacy of man left to his own devices, the necessity for the crying out for divine law, divine intervention, and then the coming of the divine, and then because of that, the ability of moving out of the depravity that you once had into a better condition, right? And that story, it's not only the story of the Exodus and the giving of the law, but then it becomes a story that is repeated over and over again at smaller degrees of scale throughout the Old Testament, right? Like if you go look at the book of Judges, or that this story of decline into sin, conquest, or
exile.
That means slavery, right?
Yep.
The calling for some sort of savior, the coming of the judge or whomever it is that's going to save you, right? Then the relative improvement, and then we're going to go back through it again. That narrative becomes the deep sort of psychological structure of the cosmos, which is, I think, a very different than the pagans. It's a very different mythology or story than the pagans have.
The closed world can't include exile and redemption.
Right.
So that is the cycle that Israel is trapped under.
Right.
Because even with Israel being in their land prior in Genesis, right? So Jacob and his sons, then they are exiled really to Egypt, and then they proceed in that exile into total slavery.
Right.
And then from there they call out for redemption and are saved. And then as the people of Israel conquer the promised land, and they eventually rise into the greatest of kingdoms, but what happens there, but you start having a valorization of the law for the self with Jeroboam and Rehoboam fighting against each other, the northern and the southern tribes. And what happens, but a Syrian invasion that goes all the way up to Jerusalem, but doesn't conquer Jerusalem, and then scatters the 10 tribes among the nations, really never to be seen again.
Right.
And so, and what happens with Jerusalem? Eventually, their law ends up ossifying into a kind of slavery, and the Babylonians come. Well, this is obviously the story of Jeremiah, and then the Babylonians come, exile Jerusalem to Babylon, and they're able to return. But eventually, you get to the Romans. But you have the cycle of exile. You have the cycle of of exile, the progression deeper into slavery, and ultimately wrath will be the term that Paul uses, and then the calling out for mercy, and then bringing out. But that cycle gets bigger as it goes until we reach the end of that cycle in Christ. And so, and just to tie that in with what you're saying, that then is instructive to the nations. that shows us the story of salvation history and how it works.
Yeah, and it's all spoken in the idiom, like we were saying earlier, the idiom of the nations, right? It's all spoken in their language, and I think though it's those movements that you're talking about. I mean, in every time there's the decline or the fall, the mini falls that are occurring, even they happen at very small levels of scale, and then they happen at bigger levels of scale too. What you have going on is a repeat of the fall, but in a different way. And I mean, what I mean is that the law has been given, the divine law has been given. It's written, and what happens then is the treatment of the now divine law as if it is human law, right? Like, so what I mean is, like, when you look at what happens, maybe looking at the monarchy helps us see this, that what is it when they cry out for a king, when they cry out to Samuel for a king, the Israelites, right? And they say, because the book of Judges, the story of the period of the Judges is a total disaster. Okay. And it's like, and they're like, give us a king like the other nations have, right? Mm-hmm. To go before us and fight our battles, right? Which is just really stupid, right? Because of course, and then what does God do? He says, I mean, it's really stupid because God explains directly to them that that's not what happens. Like he says, tell them how kings work. And they go, listen. Samuel says, listen, he's going to take your sons and they're going to be his soldiers and they're going to run before his chariots. He's going to take your daughters and they're going to be his workers. And and
he's going to tax you.
He's going to tax you. And like the power of the king is just you, right? Well, that's the explication of the Leviathan, the thing we talked about, like the what you're asking for is a king like the other nations, and the king like the other nations is merely the figurehead of the Leviathan, right? And so that's what you're asking for here, right? No, we'll have a king to go before us and fight our battles, right?
And then they get Saul.
Right, but the thing is what God says is, remember, he says that they're rejecting him as their king, right? And because the king, this is important because the king is the lawgiver, right? So he's rejecting the king. God gives them this law, and that means that he's operating as their king in this world that they live in. But when they desire a king, what they're desiring then is that they're not rejecting the law, right? Like as such, but they're thinking that the law is something that can be brought down into their world, and they can have a king, right? And they'll live according to the law under a king, like the nations have, But you go through the period of Saul, of course. But with David, ultimately, when the king is finally given, he's not the king they asked for, right? Because is David a legislator? No. What is he? I mean, like David meditates upon the law, right? Right. He isn't a king like the nations have. Like they don't. If he were, he would have become a god king, right? Like he would have been mistaken to be a god. To be God himself, but that's not what occurs, and it's because the law. He doesn't treat the law as his; he treats the law as God's.
Yeah, you can see this when he finds Saul in the cave, and then says, "I will not kill the Lord's anointed."
Yep.
But if he killed the Lord's anointed, then he would be saying, "No, I'm the one making the law."
Yeah, I'm the king, like the nations have, and so he becomes. So again, this is it's a similar instance like we talked about with the temple, where it's like you're given the thing you ask for, but not really. Do you know what I mean? It's like you're given the temple, but there's no idol in it. You're going to be given the king, but he's not like those other guys. Do you know? Like, and so it's more of that kind of condescending that you get throughout the story, and so the same plot line, like you're saying, that same basic plot line is being reiterated in different settings in different ways, and I think that's imperative. And I think the duration of it is imperative, that it goes on for so long in so many iterations that it becomes the very fabric of the minds of the people who are living through it, right? Like the very deep makeup of their worldview.
Mm-hmm. And by the fall of each of the bigger iterations God is preparing for the end of the cycle. And even with David and Solomon, you can see how Solomon asks, and I think it's actually instructive to how law works when the inclinations are not corrected by grace. So you have David, who is dancing before the ark, who is the Lord's anointed, but he won't rule as a God king. And what is Solomon when he asks God for wisdom? And God gives him wisdom. But there is a prohibition of him increasing wives, gold, and horses. Now, horses seems weird, but that's just army building.
That's army, yeah.
Yeah. So, but what happens is he ends up doing all three of those things. He builds an imperial type formation and makes alliances with other nations through taking wives and intermarrying, and therefore you have even in the bestowing of the greatest wisdom in Solomon, that because you still have the condition of fallen man and without grace, that he takes the kingship, which is looking forward to the coming of Christ, the true king, and starts to use it for his own benefit in empire building, which then sets the stage for Rehoboam and Jeroboam and the breaking of the kingdom. Yeah,
so I think that's really important. Is the wisdom of Solomon is a very important subplot here, right? Because he asked for wisdom so that he might judge, I think it actually says, so I might know good and evil. Right, as I think the way the language he uses, it's something like that. I'm almost certain. I wonder if I have it. I may very well. Well, whatever. We can find it if we need to. Hold on, maybe I have it more. Oh yeah, he says. So here he is. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in, and your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. All right, so you have the idea, first of all, that he's just a child. So you have those initial moves of humility, that I need to receive wisdom. I'm asking for it as a child. And that I might have the knowledge of good and evil, meaning like I might see beyond the law. Do you know what beyond the externals of the law into
true good and evil.
In the true good and evil. And that's wisdom. And God gives it to him. Right? And then if you read, for example, the book of wisdom, if you read it, which is awesome, everyone should read it. Right? Because what happens there is basically a unpacking and an explanation of how the pagan regimes work. I mean, he talks about their error, about the rule of death, how they think there's nothing beyond death, and that's the root of their entire disorder. He talks about the construction of idols and what they really are, and about the kings and how the kings pretend to be gods, but they're really not. He talks about child sacrifice and the function of that. I mean, he just explains how the pagan regimes work. Right? And this is obviously that wisdom, that seeing into it. But then, like you said, then he becomes it.
Yeah.
So he knows it. But this is that point that Thomas was making, that knowledge isn't enough. Right? So because of the connection between, like we were saying earlier, the connection between inclinations, virtues isn't the reality of virtue isn't merely intellectual. It's a combination of the intellectual and the volitional. And so you have to have that second piece, which is the inclination towards the receptivity of the proposition, right? In order for it to become that which leads into virtue, and so into the perfection of the person.
Or law can become an occasion for greater sin.
It does become an occasion for greater sin.
Right. Yeah. When Paul says the law tells me not to covet, and therefore all covetousness was wrought within me, that it's almost a curse that Solomon gets all this wisdom.
Exactly.
Right? It's basically
now he's more guilty for his fall. Yeah.
So the knowledge of the law increases sin, and because again, the problem is you don't have the interior, the grace necessary to live out the law.
That's why it becomes a burden, right? Yeah. It becomes a burden, like it convicts you. It's a form of punishment. Right?
Yeah, Paul saying, I have a war within my members, that you know what you are to do but can't live it. And yeah, and I want to return to the idea with the Gentiles and how they're able to be incorporated into this, and the way Paul sets it up with wrath and mercy, that Israel is spared from a good deal of wrath in given the law and given the promise. And he says the purpose of them receiving mercy is so that the promise may continue. Mm-hmm. So you have the pagans going down the cycles and trapped in the cycles, and they're under wrath. And he says, and he traces it back to like Isaac and Ishmael, for example, that God promises that the promise will continue through Isaac, your descendant. Mm-hmm. But Abraham ends up going with Hagar and having Ishmael, and he's disinherited. And Ishmael's banished, and he's exiled, and his descendants end up certainly in the pagan cycles, mm-hmm. right? In the law of nature outside.
Right.
But Isaac is spared. And it's through Isaac and then Jacob and Israel that they keep the promise, and God is faithful to his promise and will continue it. And what Paul argues is that the Israelites being spared from wrath means that they're able to continue the promise, but the Gentiles, because they experience wrath or because they experience the effects of sin, are humiliated already. Mm-hmm. So God needs to humiliate all men because they're prideful, and they need to be receptive to the coming of grace. And so the Gentiles have already gone through all the cycles. They've realized there's no escaping. Like, we're seeing it with Plato and Aristotle. Mm-hmm. We did see it. Like, right. They're stuck in it. They can't get out of it.
Yep.
And they realize they are under wrath. They realize that they have sinned and that they have gone away from what they should do. And so they're receptive to something new, to salvation. So the Israelites are spared from the wrath, given mercy, and then when the promise comes, Paul says that this is the reason why the ones who were previously under wrath are coming in such droves, why the Gentiles receive the faith so readily, is because they've already experienced the wrath. But Israel, because they have not yet experienced the wrath, need to go through a period of wrath after being shown mercy. And so the Gentiles are very ready to come into the salvation in Christ, but the Israelites are not yet, and they've been cut off, as he makes the analogy of the tree. And so what is the purpose? Paul says that he is zealous to preach among the Gentiles so that he can make his fellow kinsmen, the Jews, jealous. Mm-hmm. Because they see the grace that's given to the Gentiles. They see that they are receiving all the things that were promised to in the law, and therefore they also are humiliated because they can't live out the law, and then all Israel will be saved. That there's a reversal that goes on here. So when we're reading the old law, you have Israel experiencing the mercy, going through the cycles, being spared a number of the cycles. God bringing them out of Egypt, God bringing them into the promised land, God bringing them back from Babylon to rebuild the temple, so that the promise may continue. And then when the promise is given and the preaching of the gospel occurs, then we have the Gentiles already having experienced wrath coming in great numbers. Mm-hmm. But this is in order for Israel also to be humbled. So the point here is that the final point in Romans that he closes with in 11 is that God has consigned all to disobedience so that he might show mercy on all. That everyone has to experience the effects of wrath. Everyone has to experience the effects of sin and actually be willing to call out to God. And that it occurs in different ways for the promised people of Israel and for the Gentiles. But this is the central tension that we were discussing before about Acts, is how do you really move from old law to new law? How is it that the Gentiles can be incorporated? How is it that Israel was promised all these great things, but they don't fully come in the new law?
I mean, I think one piece that is helpful maybe is, and this comes from Thomas, because he deals with the question of why Israel was chosen. And one of his answers is something like, well, all of humanity is destined for salvation, but it was necessary that Christ be born of a single people. That it was necessary that if Christ is to be incarnate as a man, he must be a man, which means a member of a nation, which means a member of a family, a member of a tribe, a member of a nation, a member of a civilization. Mm-hmm. That's what it means to be man, like we've talked about in the earlier things, as men are these socially bound historical creatures. And so in order to become incarnate, he has to become a man, which means he has to be born of a nation, which means a nation had to be prepared for him, right? Which then goes back to the idea that it's incarnational from the beginning, that why is Israel, I think Paul's explaining how this is going to play out.
Yes.
But like, why was it necessary for one people to be singled out in the time in which it occurred, like the sequence that actually happened? Well, because Christ was going to be incarnate, and that Christ is being incarnated, right? Like the history of Israel and the history of the giving of the law, which is an articulation of the second person of the Trinity, is not separable from the coming of Christ when the incarnation itself. That is one incarnational like event, you know? And so then when you have, and so when Christ does come, and this surpasses my understanding or my expertise here, but when he does come, he comes now into a world who has this mythology I've been talking about, right? The story. He comes into a world that has the law that he can discourse on. He comes into a world that is, I think, prepared for the choice that lays before them, right? Like like they're the ones who are prepared for the choice of, do I make the law, the divine law, which is the law of God, which is the second person of the Trinity, the utterance of Christ himself? Do I make the Old Testament law a human law? Or do I allow it to explode into its infinite, like the ceiling of the law to explode because the actual law is here before me?
Yeah.
Right? So I'm faced with this choice. But the law that if I lock it down, if I put the ceiling on it and I lock it down as my law, it's the perfect act of defiance, because that law that I'm locking down and claiming to be my own is actually given by God. So it's not like the pagans who are faking like human law is divine law.
This is the
divine law.
Yeah.
So when the Pharisees do this, right? Like, and I think when you look at the narrative in the Gospels, culminating, say, in the trial of Christ in the Gospel of John, where the final move in the argument of the segment of the Jewish nation that's condemning Christ, the final move in the argument is, we have no king but Caesar, right? And they're trying to convict him according to the divine law, but then at the same time acknowledging that he calls himself the Son of God, he calls himself the King of the Jews, which in the Roman political theology is the same thing, sons of gods and kings, right? And then ultimately he must then be crucified because we have no king but Caesar. The ultimate argument there, is that the divine law, the old law, is just the same as the way the pagan laws are, only the apostasy that's involved there is way more extreme than, or the sin that's involved there is way more extreme than any sin the pagans would have been capable of. You see, so you have, so the deicide, the killing of God, is actually the killing of God. Like, and that is, it's necessary for the drama. I mean, like for the literary sort of intensity of the crucifixion, that the dichotomy between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of gods is as true as possible, right? Like as definitive, the conflict is definitive possible. And so you have a nation that's prepared precisely for that conflict. Mm-hmm. And so you have, while you have, the ones who are crucifying Christ, who are moving towards that, you have just from the exact same people, the same history, the same milieu, you have Mary, the mother of God, and the apostles and the disciples, right? Like it's a society that's prepared at an inflection point. Do you see it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Which way? Do you know?
And this and the corruption of the priesthood is what we're talking about, and that was present in the fall into Babylonian exile. If you read, and also Malachi and Zechariah prophesy this about the time of Christ, and Isaiah has it in his time too, where. And we see this in Plato and Aristotle, right? That the different ages that the rulers of the city are to go through, where they're young and they're the warriors, then they get a little bit older and they're the politicians, and then finally at the highest level they're the priests. Because like you were saying, the deep nomos, or the deep law, is really the mythology. Now, why is it that in the New Testament the biggest opponents are the Pharisees and also the Sadducees? And we have in John's gospel Caiaphas, who makes this declaration: it's better for one man to die than the whole nation to perish. And this ultimate corruption of the priesthood is that they're making, this is the potential for them to make the divine law into a human law that they control.
That's right.
So teaching as God's laws, precepts of men, as Christ calls them out on, right?
Right. This is the whole repeated charge that they're hypocrites. Right, that they're mask wearers. They're faking. They're faking like they're taking the divine law and they're portraying themselves as the mediators of the divine law, but it's actually human law. It's actually being twisted into human law. But that's exactly what all the pagan priests do.
Yes, right. But the pagan priests don't have.
They don't. It's not
the actual.
That's
power
right. They don't have the
of
actual
divine
thing.
law.
Right.
And so their ability to rule through a humanly mediated divine law that they totally control is of a greater power than any of the pagan priests could even imagine, because it is the law given by God.
I know, that's the great irony of the whole thing, because the great irony of the whole thing is that in order to appropriate that law to themselves, they make themselves the slaves of the Romans, right? Like in order to do it, Pilate wins. Like when Pilate crucifies Christ as the King of the Jews, after we've had this whole discourse with the Pharisees before Pilate, where they basically are compelled, in order to get him to crucify Christ, to admit that Caesar is their God, right? They have to basically work through that. And then Pilate says, got it, let's do it, right? Executes him as the King of the Jews. Like that is their submission into the pagan regime, that under the newly formed Roman Empire, for the first time, that has pagan god kings, the Roman Empire, right? Like so Caesar. So the irony is, right, and the ultimate move of prideful apostasy is the immediate conditions is slavery, right?
Yeah. And it's the reason why Christ has to be passed around from his initial trial with the Pharisees, in which they condemn him, even though they ask him, "Are you really the Son of God?" And he tells Daniel's prophecy that you shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven.
Right.
Like, yes,
I am.
Yeah.
Just like, are you the King of the Jews? Yeah, I am.
Yeah, and then the initial passage to Pilate, because even by passing their Messiah on to Pilate, they are recognizing Pilate's greater authority than Christ. But Pilate is wavering, and so he transfers Christ to Herod, who is the king of the Jews, even though he's an Edomite, and a pretender. And the Pharisees obviously don't like Herod for being a pretender, but they're willing to work with Herod too. And Herod just sends it back, says, "Go ahead, do whatever you're going to do." And then Pilate goes through with it. And what that like circle of evil, maniacal people there. We got the Pharisees, Pilate, and Herod making and I think it says maybe in Luke's gospel that Pilate and Herod became friends on that day.
Yeah.
They became friends through the murder of the Messiah, the King of the Jews, which takes us back to Bethlehem when his father Herod Antipas was trying to kill Christ for being the coming Messiah. Yeah. They don't want that. But what the killing of Christ for them, they think, can accomplish is the bringing of that divine law totally incorporated into the human law of Rome, and bringing it totally within it. And I think we can see this in the prophecies of Malachi and Zechariah and Isaiah and others, that this could be the ultimate. When Christ is saying this is a wicked and corrupt generation, he means it.
Yeah. I mean, I think Pilate, every time I go back and reread about Pilate, I think sometimes Pilate is portrayed as sort of like like a cynical, simplistic, I don't know, like almost in like a sort of positive light or something. I don't know, but it's very weird because when I read it, I read him coming to the steady realization that these Jews are about to prostitute themselves. Like these leaders, the leaders here are surrendering to us. Mm-hmm. Like they're
handing over the Messiah.
They're handing over their king, like the man who could have led them out of this, or like they're doing it, and so he takes them up on the offer, and that's why he writes the King of the Jews on the cross, and they go, "Hey, don't write that," and he's like, "What? That's what you guys just did."
Yeah, you just gave him to me.
You just did it. Like I think he knows within the complexity of the pagan political theology that's going on. I think he understands exactly what's happening. Mm-hmm. You know.
Yeah, it just doesn't work for him. You know, the resurrection kind of.
Well, that's right, because he doesn't believe in such things, right? For him, power is, you know.
Well, neither do the Sadducees or Pharisees.
Exactly. So, right? So it's. But I mean, really, that's getting into the new law there. But the point was to understand why the old law, how the old law is tied up into the new law.
Yes.
And how it's necessary, I think, for that very drama of the crucifixion to occur. Which we ought to talk about it in relation to the founding murder and the sacrifice and all of that we talked about earlier in the series, and that sounds like another episode. But
yes.
But that in order for that drama to have the full meaning that it has, it was necessary for this history to have occurred. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's not. You see what I mean? It's not merely that a certain mythology is being produced that then is then capable of being replicated across the nations, although I think that's true. It's not merely that there was a pedagogy that was necessary so that the people who receive Christ when he comes are ready to. I think that is true, but it's not only that. It's also that the people who crucify Christ are there, right? It's also so that part of the story is ready. You know?
Right.
So you have both, you know, it's both about Mary and about the Pharisees. It's both about the apostles and about the, you know, both sides of the drama.
Yeah, and they're all there at the foot of the cross. And then you have the Roman soldiers who are there crucifying
the
him.
onlookers who are mocking him about being the king of the Jews. And,
the Pharisees coming up and saying, and then who do you have at the foot of the cross but Mary and John, who are the only ones who didn't Mary and John, I should say, who didn't flee. And the faith that they still have there, even before the outpouring of grace. And,
right. Well, and then that's the second half of the story is
the resurrection,
and the Pentecost, and the whole defeating of the mechanisms of paganism. So at this point, we've you get to the point of the crucifixion, and like you've had the perfect example of the mechanisms of paganism, right? Like the perfect example of the way the divine law made a human law, the all the way through to the actual murder of the innocent man, the public murder of the innocent man, which is necessary in order for paganism to function, like we talked about way back when in one of our earlier episodes. Mm-hmm. So you go all the way through the whole mechanism in its perfection, and then the next shoe that drops is that the resurrection and the how it defeats it.
Yeah. It's almost like and I know we're closing here, but like the fittingness of the old law is all represented there at the very end.
That's right. That's what I think.
Like the fittingness of the old law, seeing the whole thing through, it's all brought back at the very end of the crucifixion of Christ.
I think that's what Thomas's point is here. Yeah. Is that we start out in the Treatise on Law with this philosophical, anthropological, kind of cosmological understanding of what the world is, what man is, how society works, all that. And then we're going to go through this whole history and culminate it here at the end. And it's like that's the totality of human history is about the cross and resurrection, the crucifixion and resurrection. Like that's the reason why all of this happened. It's the reason why the nations went off their own ways and did their things. It's the reason why Israel was chosen. It's the whole story is about that. Mm-hmm. But that is the destruction of the pagan mechanisms that we've been talking about, right? Like that's the point.
All right, I think we'll close there. Fantastic. So okay. I think we should continue that, maybe include some Romans
we have to talk about the new law.
The new law, yeah. We haven't really gotten to grace. We've built it all the way up to here.
To that, right.
Yeah, this was wonderful. So thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.